What does it mean to open source an algorithm? It's not as simple as, say, open sourcing a program or any other type of application. And when Elon Musk bought Twitter and said, I'm going to open source the algorithm, it was probably more complex than he or really most people at Twitter truly understood. The logistics of open sourcing an algorithm are extraordinarily complex because, especially with something like Twitter, there isn't just one algorithm. The code itself only explains the architecture. It doesn't explain anything deeper than that. And you need much more to really understand why an algorithm or a model does what it does. So let's start with what Twitter's recommender does. It curates your feed, your Twitter feed. All the tweets that are shown to you in your timeline are curated by this algorithm, which is a recommender system. It recommends content to you. So what's its objective? How do you determine whether it was successful or not? Most of the objective is to get you to stay on platform. Why? Because you are being monetized through the number of ads that Twitter can show you on your timeline. That's how Twitter makes most of its money, is through advertising. And so it's an ad-supported business model. Obviously, that's the intent of the content recommender. Now, how does it accomplish that? Hypothetically, it shows you content that you're interested in, that you'll engage with, and that will keep you on the platform for longer. It will keep you coming back to the platform and increase your total time and their ability to serve you ads, the number of ads that they can show to you and the amount of money that they make off of you as a result. But open sourcing an algorithm isn't just about the code, because the code, like I said, it's just the approach. And you're going to get very little information from the approach that Twitter used to train its algorithm, because that's all it is. That is the architecture. What you also need, and this is the big differentiator between traditional software and models, the model itself is trained on data. And like I said, with Twitter, there are multiple models at play. You can be recommended one feed on your mobile device and a completely different feed on the desktop version of Twitter. There are retraining steps. Twitter's algorithm is retrained daily. So changes to your particular feed are dependent upon the new data that Twitter has gathered about you or people like you, or whatever it is that they use to figure out how to segment you. And segmentation is an important part of really understanding how the algorithm works. You are put into a category called a segment, which hopefully defines people who do similar things to you, who like similar content, who consume content in similar ways to you. And so if it's popular for part of your segment, the algorithm will assume it will be popular across that segment. And so it's more likely to serve you content based on your segment. And your segment can change from day to day. Twitter knows that, which is why it retrains the algorithm so frequently, so that you are not stuck in an old assumption about what feed you would like best. Any change in behavior is brought into what segment that you are, as granularly as possible, categorized in. So the recommendations, that Twitter feed that gets curated for you, is as accurate as possible and is likely to lead to the highest engagement possible. That also requires some form of open sourcing. So it's not only the model's architecture, which is the code, it's not just the data that it's trained on initially and understanding what the model started out as. It's also understanding the differences in models between any given platform that you may be using. It's the retraining piece of it. What data does it use to retrain? So all of this is extraordinarily complex. If the trained models themselves were all released, if they were open sourced, it really wouldn't help people either, because you would have to try to figure out why this particular model made a decision for you specifically. You might be able to glean some high-level rules about the model. But again, models don't behave like software does. There's no true logic programmed in except for the logic that the model learns from the data and from continuous retraining and from improvement over time. It's very, very difficult to make granular sort of predictions and understandings of why the model does what it does when the model is that complex. So open sourcing the entirely built model isn't going to be very helpful either. What you have to do is something called model explainability. Now, this is where you truly create transparency into how the model operates on a very granular basis. So what would that look like? Well, you would be able to, on each one of the tweets that you are shown in your timeline, you can click on something that allows you to see why you were shown this particular tweet. There are some very simplistic explanations for explainability at a very high level. I engage with certain people on Twitter. And so those people, when they like something, when they retweet something, when they comment on something, it's very likely for that tweet, even if I don't follow the person who tweeted what they liked or retweeted, if that has been liked and engaged with by someone who I interact with regularly, the algorithm is going to make an assumption and say, hey, I'm going to serve this to you because you like this person and this person likes this particular content. So maybe you will too. And that's fairly reasonable. But it's more complex than that. I follow topics. I follow data science, but I also follow sneakers. Now, it's showing me tweets from those topics of interest from people that I may not necessarily follow or have ever engaged with in the past. It's going to say at a very simplistic level, if I say, why did you show me this tweet? Because you're interested in data science, therefore we showed you a tweet about data science. Now you have to evaluate, well, okay, that's great from a surface level, but what's really going on under the covers? Because there are obviously tens of thousands of tweets that it could have shown me. It's not filtering by latest, most recent. It's showing me very intentionally a tweet about this topic and choosing not to, which is a counterfactual case, which isn't just why did you show me this? Why didn't you show me something else? Why didn't you show me all these thousands and thousands of other tweets that I may have been interested in? Why'd you pick this one? And that becomes a more granular question. When you look at any given tweet in your timeline, when you follow 500 different people, if your timeline only has tweets from 25 of them or 50 of them, how did Twitter decide, well, these are the ones that I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you these tweets from these people. Why did it choose those? What data points does it use to figure out that these are the right ones to show me and not show me all these other ones that I could be interested in because I follow these people? Shouldn't I see everyone who I follow's tweets in chronological order? Wouldn't that be the most logical way to show them to me? Well, no. When it comes to engagement, it actually turns out that Twitter has learned it isn't necessarily that all people that I follow are created equal. And if you follow over 1,000 people, the amount of content that you could be bombarded with is overwhelming if everyone was weighted equally, and that would not optimize your time on device. And that's their goal. So the algorithm itself has an objective. And we want to understand that objective. We also want to understand why at a very granular level. What is it about this particular piece of content or this feed in general that makes it more likely for me to stay on this device for longer? Why did you choose this one? And why didn't you choose all these other ones? Those are the more granular explanations. And that's where things get very, very complicated. Why'd you decide to show me a particular tweet about a shoe? Is that tweet popular because it's a great tweet, because it's a thing that people love? Or do people engage with it? Do people love it because it was recommended to them frequently? And you begin to realize therein is the rub. The recommender is now part of this decision-making process. It is serving content, and in many ways, it's overriding your ability to choose. It's using your preferences. It is using some criteria that it assumes will optimize your time on device, which you could argue that is something that your goal is too. You want to be entertained. If you're entertained, you'll stay on device. You want to be educated. If you want to be educated and you are being educated, you'll stay on device. So there is definitely an argument to say that Twitter's goals, the recommenders' goals, and yours are well aligned. But are they really? That's when you start looking at what wasn't I served? What content have I missed? Why was this the one that you showed me? And is that limiting my total exposure to the type of content that I actually want? Am I being funneled into an echo chamber? When it comes to education, that's a very important thing. When you think about data science and machine learning, you want to learn from diverse perspectives, because if you hear the same things over and over again, what if there's something wrong in there? What if you're not getting exposed to enough content to truly be proficient at our field? What if you're missing some things, some recent developments that your particular echo chamber just doesn't think are that interesting or that valuable, but in reality, you would think it's interesting and valuable and educational? That's the complexity. What do you want to be shown, and how much of that decision do you want to put into the hands of something else, of the recommender and the recommendation system? The more complex concepts here at play are really around individual choice. What happens when I'm making a decision and a machine, a model, is now part of that decision-making process? Well, it changes the dynamics of decision-making. It changes the dynamics of the Twitter community and of what content rises to the top and what content doesn't. What content just kind of fails? Was that content worth sharing above others? These are all opinion-based questions. And the problem with the recommender is it's very difficult to align the recommender's opinion with yours in all cases. There will always be some margin of error. There'll always be some hedging of the bets. You don't want to go too controversial, because what if you then anger that person by showing something that's so different? The person looks at it and says, I don't like this. Not just, I don't want to look at this and keep scrolling, but I don't like this. When you have a conflicting ideology or a conflicting message, and it's so conflicting that it is offensive. Think about a vegetarian being served some content about beef or meat. That person may decide to continue scrolling, or they may look at it and say, why'd you say no? And they may leave the platform. And so you want to try to keep content as homogenous as possible, as closely aligned with your understanding of that person as possible, so as not to offend them. But in so doing, there is a balancing act. Is the recommender also, by playing it safe and being conservative, presenting an inadequate view or partial coverage that reinforces biases and doesn't serve you with the content that you truly are interested in, making you think maybe that content doesn't exist, maybe those ideas aren't out there? That's an interesting application. And so what you find is when you have systems that are human systems, people interacting with each other, and you introduce a model, you introduce a machine or any sort of automation, that model with its level of independence is going to then change the governing dynamics of that system. And so what we really want to understand when we talk about open sourcing a model and model explainability is we want to, as individuals, understand how the model changes the governing dynamics of our human system, Twitter, of these interactions between people, and what tweets we are shown and how that changes our opinions, the content that we're able to view. We want control of that. We want to be able to say, no, I want more diverse sources. We want to be able to limit the sources that we are shown. There are so many different options, and it's almost impossible to provide every possible configuration and support all of those to truly create an open platform where you can see anything that you want to, where you can control that recommendation to the point where everything that you see is exactly the way you want it. It's nearly impossible. That's the difficulty of open sourcing an algorithm, is that it's not so much that you just want to see the code. It isn't enough to see the data, and in more times than not, the data and the trained model are far too complex for anyone to really go through and understand personalized. What does this mean for me? Not just what does this mean for the average person, but what does this mean for me? And then when you talk about explainability frameworks, being able to dive in and understand why your feed was curated in the way it was, that's really not the end goal. You do want to understand it, but understanding is going to lead to you and most users wanting to be able to control, have more control over what it is that they see and how your feed is curated. It is very difficult to support all the different ways that you may want to curate your feed using a logical process, using software development, which is why we have models. The models are there to learn from the data sets that we provide them, and there is no one model. We are trying, you look at Twitter, they are trying to personalize this as much as possible through those segmentations and creating a model that continually learns from your preferences, interactions, a ton of different types of behavioral data. And that's what we want to know about when it comes to open sourcing a model. We want to understand how the model itself decides any given thing about us or how to curate the feed. So we want to understand that piece, but then we want control. And so we cannot get control through a logical process, through that traditional software development. We still need models because the interactions are too complex. And the fine tuning, again, is too complex for us to program all the possible switches into place that would allow you to curate your feed in exactly the way that you want to. We need to take data that you produce based on your interactions, your behaviors on Twitter, and we need to learn from those and then use that learning to continuously improve your feed. And I think the interesting thing about what's going to happen now is since we're no longer optimizing for time on platform because we don't need advertising. If you change away from that advertising model, which sounds like Elon Musk wants to do, I don't know if it's possible. I'm just going to caveat this whole thing with, I don't know if it's possible to completely go away from ad-supported model or ad business model. If that ends up being implemented, now the motivation for the algorithm is different. But no matter what, there's always going to be a different agenda for the algorithm than there is completely for you. You will always have, or potentially have, different objectives than the algorithm does. And once that happens, the algorithm changes the dynamics of your feed and changes the dynamics of the interaction between you and all the other people on Twitter. So no matter which algorithm gets used, this is always going to be a problem. When it comes to open sourcing an algorithm, the work that it takes to create a true explainability framework that'll answer the kind of questions that you want to be answered, that work is exceptionally complex. I don't think Elon Musk has a good grasp on how hard this will really be in practice. I don't even think most of the people at Twitter understand the complexities of giving that sort of transparency to users. I think this is going to be a bigger problem than anyone truly anticipates because they haven't thought through all of the implications of giving people this access. And like I said, once they understand how the model works, they're going to want to be able to tweak it themselves. There is an entirely different set of problems. So open sourcing an algorithm, it's not about the code. It's not even about the data or the trained model. It's about what's called model explainability. That's going to be complex because these models, like I said, not just one model, and these models are extraordinarily complicated. There is no simple explanation unless you just want something surface level that truly doesn't answer the question. So we could placate users. Twitter could go that route where they just give you a really simple explanation that makes you feel like you know what's happening, but truly isn't that end goal of transparency, of understanding the more nuanced version of why your feed was curated one way and not necessarily a different way, especially answering that other case. Why didn't I get served other tweets? That's even more complex. So we're going to see, hopefully, I really hope we do see the nuanced, complex version released. However, I don't know that Twitter or Elon Musk has the resources, or really the desire, the motivation to do that level of transparency. So while we're likely to see some level of transparency, I don't know that we're going to drive this to the full end game, to where it could potentially end up being something transformational in the way that people understand and interact with models. Reason why, from a data science standpoint, this is so important, and the reason why I hope we go to that end goal, is because we're never going to establish trust in people until we can give them an explainability framework that allows them to say, I feel like, number one, I'm in control, which is that change and the tweaking and the ability to work with the algorithm to continually improve their feed. But also, from a transparency standpoint, if you don't understand why it works, you are less likely to engage with it in high-value use cases. It's that concept of trust. We're not going to get people to trust us as a field or our models for things like autonomous driving or, even higher value use cases until we show a level of transparency and until we teach people really what's going on under the covers of models and give them a reason to trust them, give them some way to begin to understand their relationship with AI, with models, with these recommender systems, and how they interact with, people. How does a human in the loop, human machine teaming, how does that work? And how will it keep enough control in the hands of people for them to feel comfortable using models? That's a question we have to answer. And if we don't, we just aren't going to build enough trust for people to use machine learning models in these high-value use cases where there are significant consequences for failure. So like I said, I think this is something critical for us to do. I hope Twitter does it. However, at the same time, I am concerned about the level of effort, the cost, and whether there's really a motivation at this point to do this, to go all the way with the explanations.